Turns out that biblical history has a long history. Here are the different periods that we have in the biblical, in the Bible, going all the way from the beginning, from the very beginning in First Genesis, all the way up into the era of the Christian era, where the Romans were in charge. I'm a little flustered. I haven't changed this since 7:30 this morning. You notice that these are in black. The reason I put these in red is because later on, when we get into the Deuteronomy history, we're going to talk quite a bit about what happened in this particular area and why these are colored. Because after about 640 BC, actually it was 609 BC, the Israelites were never again an independent nation until 1947. For over 2,000 years. They're always under the dominion of somebody else. First Egypt, then the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, then we get to the Christian era. It's the Romans. Here is one of my most recent slides, a summary of Old Testament history. There are parts of the Old Testament that are history, and there are some parts that are not. I want to talk first of all a little about this Torah. This is a very significant thing, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on. The Torah is sometimes called the first 5 books of Moses, or the books of Moses, or they're often referred to as the books of law. Now, actually, why do I include that in the history? Because a lot of very pertinent history shows up in the Torah. Although if you go to the Torah, and we'll be doing a little bit of that, you'll find out that most of it actually deals with the law. I checked on that this morning in Leviticus. There is practically nothing in Leviticus dealing with anything like history. It is all law. And that is why when you hear Jesus talk about the law and the prophets, he's talking actually about the Torah. When he talks about the prophets, he's actually talking about the Deuteronomic histories. The Deuteronomic histories we'll go into quite a bit later on in great detail. But they include these 6 books: Joshua, Judges, the 1st and 2nd Kings, the 1st and 2nd of Samuel. Now, these are distinctive from these. These are the priestly histories. This we will spend quite a bit of time talking about, but not using them too much. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are different from the. I read not too long ago something I found quite interesting. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are very, very similar to what you find in Deuteronomy histories, because the writer of the first and 2nd Chronicles had the Deuteronomy histories right in front of him. He copied it right from them. As a matter of fact, the most recent I have seen that these Chronicles and there must be a K in there somewhere. Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah were probably not written until about 300 BC. Or 399 BC, very late on coming. I've also included here several of the prophets contain a lot of history. When we get to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, there's a lot of history that's shown in those books. It's also true with some of the minor prophets. Amos, for example, is a very good example of some material that tells us quite a bit about history. Let's take a look at the now. All right, here's an abbreviation, what I just looked about this documentary hypothesis, which the Torah is very much dependent upon. This documentary hypothesis is strictly what I said a couple weeks ago. It's a hypothetical way of approaching what was found in the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. From about the time that they were canonized, which would be about 100 AD, right, about 100 years after Christ, from the time they were canonized, people looked at the Torah, they looked at the first 5 books in an inerrant manner. What does that mean? That means that there were no mistakes, just the way it is written, and don't discuss it. That's the way it is written. It wasn't until the late 1700s and well into the 1800s that the documentary hypothesis came about. And what was that? simply that some of the discrepancies that we find in the Torah, some of the discrepancies we find in those books seem to, well, they seem to bother us. We'll take a look at them a little bit more carefully. But somebody concluded it wasn't a matter of Moses, who was supposedly the writer of these books, getting old and maybe a bit senile, or it wasn't a matter of the scribes, but actually what they were looking at in the Torah was not a book, but they were looking at 3 or actually 4 different sources. And these 4 different sources were put together. Now, what are these sources? J stands for Yawis. The J is not Y because the Germans don't have Y, they have a J. J is one of the sources. E stands for Elohist. J and Elohist are the two sources that deal very much with what you might call political history in terms of stories. They are very often combined into one book, and very often, and I'll show you a little bit later, they are actually combined physically to make one story. In addition to this was the priestly document, a priestly source. The priestly source, when combined with the JE source, with a certain amount of, what does R stand for, you remember? Redactor, editors. When it was edited, it was put into the Torah. But you notice I didn't say anything about this. Deuteronomy sort of stands by itself. Find out that when we look at the book of Deuteronomy, the language is even different, but even the material that we find is different in a sense in the way that it's presented. It is included, however, in the Torah. I'll tell you why it's included in the Torah. Because it has so much in the book of Deuteronomy that is law. And they said, here is another example of the law being with those other 4 books. We'll put them all together. We'll call them the 5 books of the law or the 5 books of Moses. Actually, what we find is that this book of Deuteronomy, and we'll look at that a little bit later today, is responsible for what we call the Deuteronomic histories. Those are the Kings and Samuel, Joshua, and Judges. As a matter of fact, I will show you later on that there's a almost direct relationship in terms of the language and going from Deuteronomy to the Deuteronomic histories. But the Torah itself contains all 5 of these books. This is a very useful slide that I should have found years ago and I didn't, but tells us a little bit of all of these 4 sources and some of their history. First of all, the dates. We take a look at this at the priestly source. I don't have a title. Yeah, the priestly source. The priestly source was written about the time that Solomon was king. Actually, maybe a little bit after Solomon. It is the oldest of these sources in some sense. The Elohist source was about 100 years later. The difference between the Elohist and the priestly sources are 2. One is the Yawis source and the Elohist source. The Yawis source deals almost entirely with things that are going on in Judah, in the southern part of Israel nation, whereas the Elohist deals with the northern 10 tribes. The other thing is that the reason they get those names is that in the Yawis source, God is referred to as Yahweh, and in the Elohist source, he's referred to as Elohim, and that's how they got those particular initials. But take a look at this date here. This is about 100 years after, the Elohist source is about 100 years after the Yahweh source. Skip the Deuteronomy, skip this source, right? Look at this P source. The P source was a document that was written by the priests. Now, what is listed here is a period of about 550 BC. For a long time, it was believed that the document, that the priestly source was written about the time of the exile. Maybe actually during the exile, we don't really know. But there's an awful lot of evidence that this part is probably more pertinent. It may have even been earlier. It may have been actually during the reign of Hezekiah, which would have made it about 700 BC, around 700 BC. The Deuteronomic source, we know pretty much when that was written. That was written very likely around 640 BC, or maybe 630. I'll tell you something about dates, plus or minus a little bit. The date, if you want a certain date, just read long enough, you'll find the date you want on some of these things. This we know pretty much when it was written because of its history. We will go back to this particular slide on occasion because it does have information that's valuable. Right now we're going to talk about the Yawis and the priestly sources in the book of Genesis. All three of them show up in the book of Genesis. Now the reason I'm doing that is that if you recall, think hard about it, for the last year or so we've been talking about the book of Genesis. Remember anything you remember last year? It's a year that's sort of lost, but we started way back when, going very carefully through the book of Genesis and looking at the stories that we have in Genesis. And I did spend a little bit of time trying to point out at that time that we could pick out what were the Yawis and the Elohis and priestly sources and where some of these stories actually had come from. And we're going to do a little bit of this right now. But we're going to be doing it looking at, well, first of all, I'll show you the tables that I used. I want to say something about these tables. Here are the four sources. This is one of the appendices in one of the books that I have. This is a book by Friedman. And I found something kind of interesting about his citations here. If you take a look at that, there's a lot of Yahweh sources that are showing up in the first part of Genesis. And nothing about the Elohim source, except the Elohim source doesn't show up when? It doesn't show up until it becomes pertinent in terms of the 10 tribes that is separated from the other tribes. And that's why we see nothing of the Elohim here, but we do have quite a bit of the Yawis and some of the priestly sources showing up very early in the book of Genesis. I think I have a little bit more on there. Here's the second one. That this takes care of it. Well, have you got those memorized now? Because we'll go back. I want to show you something that's kind of interesting about these citations. Here's a citation taken from Genesis 37. If you remember the story of Genesis now, you remember that near the end of the book of Genesis is all devoted to Joseph. And the interesting thing about the story that we have of Joseph running from about chapter 37 on, the interesting thing that we find is that there's so much interaction between Joseph and his brothers. There's a lot of interaction between Joseph and his brothers, and there are a lot of citations to Joseph and his brothers from both the priestly source, from both the Elohim source and from the Yahweh source. We find that in chapter 37. 37 talks about the Yahweh, but you notice something kind of interesting here? A and B. Let me tell you about this redactor. This redactor had a chore. The chore was really not much more than this. Look, we got these three sources. How are we going to present them to the people so that they can read them and not say, hey, that one's right and that one's better than that one. That one doesn't read at all. He was faced with a real problem of trying to find what was the way of letting people know that they should be reading these sources. He came up with an idea, an interesting idea. Why not unite all three sources into one story? And what he tried to do, what he attempted to do, was to take three different sources and make a unit out of them by intermingling them. As a consequence, we will find that there are some verses that we have in the Torah, like in chapter 37 of Genesis, that is divided into an A and B section, because there is something both from the Elohim and from the Yahweh source. Now, you may ask the question, was this a good idea? It was truly a fantastic idea. The idea of the three sources didn't last very long as they had the Torah, because they had just one single source. And from approximately, I would say, probably around 300 or 400 BC, people looked at the Torah and said, okay, that's where we find out about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's where we find it in the Torah. And they never thought about the fact that those may have come from different sources, that there might have been different stories. They would have thought, hey, there's mistakes that he makes. I'll show you some of the mistakes that he makes by saying the wrong thing. And the reason it comes out as being the wrong thing, because two different sources are being used, but guess what? The redactor is trying to show that both sources are being used and not one thrown out. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this is that when this first came out, the people would take a look at this and say, oh, what's he trying to do? Oh, there's something from our source. That's the people that like the Yawis source. Then the people from the Elohim source, did he include, oh yeah, there's stuff from our source, there is stuff from all sources showed up. People did not recognize these as being three different sources until about the late 1700s. It wasn't until the late 1700s that this whole idea of the documentary hypothesis came about. And it wasn't well into the 1800s of Wellheisen that the documentary hypothesis was actually stated, and people could very carefully look at the Torah and find evidence of all three different sources. Now, I have not tried this. I don't have the time to try it, but I have been told that if you take the Torah and you separate it into those parts that we say are Yawis, those parts that are Elohim, and those parts that are priestly source, you'll have all the three separate sources, because essentially not much is left out of any one of them. Fantastic idea of trying to get all three of these things together, and guess what? Try to melt them together into a single source. I will ask you a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer, but did it work? It worked for about 2,000 years, making it the best-selling book that existed in the Western Hemisphere. For a long time, people never realized that this was just three different sources presented, or four different sources presented as a single story. Some of that will show up when we look at some of the material. Now, I did not label all these too well. I'll get back to that one later on. Here is another group of citations of the priestly source. What have I told you about these slides in the past? These are my notes. I'm letting you look at my notes. I'm hanging on to some things that I want to keep. The interesting thing about the Bible is that it starts out with Genesis 1, and the first part of the Bible that we have is one of the last parts of the Bible that was actually written. It was written by the priestly source, and it was written after the time of the exile in Babylon, which was around 500 and ended around 540 BC. Everybody is familiar with this first verse of chapter 1 of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Here is the story that we find. All of these 6 days in which the creation took place. They know that this was probably written after the exile, because this Genesis 1 is based almost entirely on a Babylonian epic called the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish was the Babylonian creation story. Now, let me tell you very quickly about that Babylonian creation story. It also talks about 6 periods in which the main god, Elohim, main god, chose 6 different gods to take care of different periods. And these 6 gods became the governors or the rulers of the Babylonians at that time. What the priestly writer did is said, I like that idea, but he changed it a little bit differently. Instead of having different gods, he had one God, God the Creator, and then showed in 7 days the different parts of the creation, all the way from the very beginning of the cosmos and into vegetation, and I'll run on through in here. There are 6 of them. You know what was interesting in the Enuma Elish was that after God had created these 6 and appointed these other 6 gods, you know what he did? He rested on the 7th. Does that ring a bell? And that's exactly what was done with the book of Genesis. They made that the 7th. If you go to the Bible carefully and read Genesis 1, you go to Genesis 1 and Genesis 1, chapter 1, and the first verse of chapter 2 is still dealing with the priestly approach, but then all of a sudden it gets to the Yawis. And that's where we get the story of Adam and Eve. This is one of my favorite favorite pictures of Adam and Eve. Not because of Adam and Eve, but because of the serpent. You notice that the serpent here has what? Has legs. Remember in the story that we have in the Bible, what does it say? The serpent was cursed and forced to what? Crawl on its belly. But this was before the serpent had tempted Eve to eat from the apple from the tree of knowledge. But here is the old serpent. I look at that serpent's face, and I don't want to offend anybody. You know what he looks like? He looks like a used car dealer. That was followed by the story of of Cain and Abel. And the story of Cain and Abel, we showed the real big difference between the two, and that is that Cain here is involved in what? Raising grain. You can't see his fire, but he's sacrificing with grain, whereas Abel is sacrificing with a sheep, with the herd, with part of the herd. Remember a couple of weeks ago I mentioned to you that as far as the Egyptians were concerned, there was a real antagonism between sheep herders and raisers of grain. That idea of those two people, those two groups separating themselves in terms of their economy goes all the way back into a story of Cain and Abel. The next story is the story of Noah. This is a particularly interesting story because the Old Testament is the only place that has a story of a great flood. But Noah was ordered by God to prepare a ship, appropriate ship, to take care of a great flood that was going to take place. Why did I make mention of that as being peculiar? Because just about every other society has a story about what? About the great flood. Whether they are related to the Hebrews, to the Israelite background, or the biblical background, we don't know. But they all have a story about a flood. This, we do not know exactly when it took place, but there are some very significant things about the flood. One of them is that at the end of the flood, there was a very important celebration by Noah in which he sacrificed to God. Now, if you take a look at this picture, you see the animals are free again, and Noah is standing by an altar here, is sacrificing. Now, if you go to the Bible itself, you'll find out that in the book of Genesis, it talks about this flood in a very interesting fashion. And this will point out one thing that has been a concern to people for a long time, particularly when they were stuck with the inerrant approach of the Bible, in that there seem to be two stories being told here. Let's take a look at that once. It talks about putting the animals on the ark. In the Yahweh source, it's very clear. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals. I'm skipping all the way to verse 15. And they entered, and they that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. There's nothing about clean animals. 2 different stories. 7 pairs of all clean animals, and all of the others. What we have here in the priestly source is no mention of the clean animals. Now, I've talked to ministers about this before. I said, have you ever read that whole chapter at one time from the pulpit, where the two contradictions? There are two contradictions because this is a priestly background. This is a Yawis background. What's important about this priestly background, they entered male and female. No indication of clean animals. Now what's the significance of that? You need a clean animal to do what? To have a sacrifice. What the Yahweh source says that Noah had a sacrifice after the flood. The priestly source is not going to allow that. Now hang on to this because we're going to talk about it quite a bit later on. The reason the priestly source doesn't say that is because in the priestly source it says that only priests that are descendants from Aaron can make sacrifices, and they are the only ones. Well, there is no priest from a descendant of Aaron at the time of Moses, at the time of Noah, therefore there can't be a sacrifice. Therefore, the priestly source just leaves it out. It just leaves this contradiction. But again, I would suggest that if you're approaching somebody for the first time about the story of the flood, don't read that whole chapter in completion, because people say, well, just a second, what's going on here? Here is Genesis 7, and if you take a look at this, you'll find that where's 7 here? Yeah. Here is the part that we read first. This is the part that is the Yahweh source. This is the priestly source that was read that we read later on. The next story that comes about is the Tower of Mabel, or Tower of Mabel, whatever you want to call it. Think that this one might took place approximately 10,000 BC, 11,000 BC. But the reason it is included as a part of the priestly source is because it explains why there were languages that became a significant part of society in that era. If you remember, a few months ago, we talked about the fact that between between the Tower of Mabel and the time of Abraham, there's a period of about 10,000 years, which the Bible says what? Does anybody remember? That's correct. Nothing. Absolutely nothing at all in the Bible about a 10,000 year period between Tower of Mabel and the time of Abraham. We did talk about that rather extensively in class here, about the fact that archaeology has shown us that an awful lot of history had taken place. And a lot of the things that took place in history between 10,000 BC and about 1800 BC, a lot of that history had a big effect on what happened at 1800 BC. Just to refresh your memory just a little bit, what we found is that during that 10,000 year period, among other things, was Sargon the Great and the elimination of the old civilization, the Sumerian civilization, and the coming of a period around 1800 BC where there was a complete total confusion in Mesopotamia at that time. And that's what prompted Terah, Abraham's father, to leave Mesopotamia and move out to the west and toward Canaan. When we get to the story of Abraham, we get a lot of stories that are not long. They are great stories, and they're probably some of the most humane stories that you can possibly imagine in many ways. The fact that Sarah and Abraham had no children, but he did have children with one of his with Sarah's slave, Hagar, and that was Ishmael. And we get this very poignant story of how Abraham, at the instigate, you see Sarah back here? What is she saying? Get that woman out of here. And Hagar had to leave with Ishmael. We get the story of Isaac being taken up on the mountain to be sacrificed. Great details on that story as well. We get the story that Isaac married Rebekah and had twin sons. Look at these two sons. You see something different about their hair? Esau's got red hair. Jacob has not red hair. what do we know about Esau's descendants? The Edomites, and they are also associated with what? The red clay that was prominent in Edom at that time. What we find in that story, again, is something that is very, very much showing us things concerning what you call the human condition, of people behaving as if they were human. What we find is that in the story of these two sons is that Isaac favored Esau, who was a hunter. Rebekah favored Jacob, who stayed very much close to the tents and close to the things that were right at home. That led to a very serious situation in which Esau, being the firstborn, had the birthright. Jacob bought the birthright from him in a devious sort of a manner, and even managed to get his father's blessing by Jacob posing as Esau to get his father's blessing from Isaac. Again, I didn't even label these. You remember all this. Does anybody remember any of this? Okay. What was really pertinent is that Jacob had to get the heck out and leave, because when Esau found out what Jacob had done, Esau swore that as soon as his father Jacob, as soon as Isaac died, he was going to kill Jacob. And what we find is that Rebekah urges Jacob to get out and leave. Here we have a picture of Jacob getting the blessing from Isaac again. You notice what Rebekah is doing over here is keeping an eye out to make sure that Esau doesn't show up at the wrong time. Great stories, even though they're in the book of the law. I talked about this a little bit last week, and that is that on his way up north, way up into Haran, about 500 miles from where this first part of the story took place, which was in Beersheba, which is in Judah, about 500 miles to go. On the way there, that's where he encountered the blessing that he had gotten from God, that his children, his descendants, would be the new nation. When he got up north, again, we get great stories, really great stories, because when we get up there, I have another picture that shows both shows Leah and Rachel. Here's Rachel, here's Leah. This was taken after the marriage, but Jacob fell in love almost immediately with Rachel and made an arrangement with Laban, their father, to marry Rachel. Now he would marry Rachel, but he had to work 7 years to marry Rachel. He married Rachel in a wedding, but he got up in the morning and found out that he hadn't married Rachel, but he had married Leah, and he was told that, well, the older sister always has to marry before the first sister. What had to happen is that Jacob had to renegotiate with Laban, and he decided to work another 7 years for Rachel. 14 years that he had committed himself to working for Laban. Now, why bring that up? Because during that time, he had children, not only with Leah, but also with the servants of Leah and Rachel. And all told, he had, I think, a total of 11 sons here that are being born. In other words, what had been predicted in the story that we had of Jacob seeing the angels going up and down the ladder, and that he wouldn't have generations to follow him, did come true. All of a sudden, there are a number of sons that he had from Leah. He had 6 sons from Leah, 2 each from these 2 servants, Zilpah and Bilhah. Rachel did not have any children until Joseph came along, just before they probably left. Benjamin was not actually born until they got back to Canaan. But what happened is that I found very interesting, and you should find interesting too, is that if you read this, it reads like a story. It reads like a great story because there's a lot more to it involving Laban and a number of other types. These are in the book of law. But what I'm trying to point out is that in the books of the law, we do have a lot of history as well. Here's a picture of Jacob's sons. Oh, here are there. Among those sons were whom? Among those sons was Joseph. Joseph was born to Rachel, which is what was his favorite wife by far, and he spoiled Joseph. We get the story of Joseph with the coat of many colors, and we get the story of Joseph and his brothers. Here's a very interesting situation. He did not get along well with his brothers. He wasn't aware of it, but they were well aware that they did not like him because of the fact that he had dreams that would indicate that at one point in their lives they would be bowing down to him, and they decided a way to get around this is let's get rid of him. And actually they decided to kill him. At the last minute they decided not to kill him, but they would sell him as a slave. Now here's a picture of money being exchanged. You see Joseph back here being led away as a slave. Money being exchanged between some travelers and the brothers, which were getting money for Joseph. Here's another picture of take a look at what we find in the Old Testament, is that this story is told in Genesis 37. Now you'll notice that Genesis 37 has Genesis 37 3b and Genesis 37 3a. Here is a single verse that's divided between two different sources. Two different sources. How does that actually read? In the Torah, it reads this way: the Midianite traders passed by and then drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Well, what matter? Why didn't you sell him to the? Well, because you got two different sources here. What did people do with this? Well, for centuries they didn't do anything. It was said, well, somebody made a mistake. Oh, maybe Moses was getting old, or maybe one of the scribes had misinterpreted something and just wrote the wrong thing. No, it actually is that we're getting evidence of the fact that we're getting the same story told from two different directions, and they just had little slight differences in it. Is it possible that two people could see something and then go to separate ways and tell different stories? Absolutely. What we find is that Joseph went into slavery. He was sold to Potiphar, and the story of Potiphar's wife, again, can you equal that story? It's as good as anything you're going to find. Whoops. And the last part of that we have in Genesis is the fact that Joseph was able, with his brothers, to convince his father Jacob to move to Egypt. And we have the last part of the book of Genesis of Jacob blessing his sons. Here's Joseph when he was actually made a ruler. Again, remember the story of how that came about? Because of the ability that Joseph had of interpreting dreams. The last bit of Genesis actually shows something that's quite significant. It shows that Jacob had requested that he be buried back in Canaan, and Pharaoh had arranged for a large funeral train to take him back to Canaan. I've only just barely skimmed over the top of what we could find here. Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, what does it say underneath there? To be announced. Now, the reason I'm not going to go into that at this point is the following. What we find in Genesis works out pretty well in regard to looking at the citations from one source and another source, and no real conflicts. It doesn't take too long to get into the book of Exodus, and this is what I found, what made me change my mind, is that all of a sudden you get some real confusion. Let me give you an example of what I mean by confusion. what you find out is that very early in the book of Genesis, oh, by the way, of Exodus, we're going to go into this in some real detail in looking at Exodus and at Numbers. Not at Leviticus, but Exodus and Numbers. We're going to look at them very carefully and see how they have taken these different sources and talked about different things in these different sources. Let me tell you something that happens in Exodus. It isn't too long before we get into the story of Moses that we find out that Moses' older brother Aaron shows up on the scene. At the time of the fiery bush, which we'll be talking about later, we find that Moses makes the claim that I don't speak well. I don't speak well. And the suggestion is made, well, get your brother to speak for you. And what we find is that when we get to Moses and Aaron approaching Pharaoh and requesting that the people be released, which was what the charge was given to him at the fiery bush, that Aaron is doing the speaking. Aaron is doing the speaking, not Moses, and that falls right in line. But then we find out something else, that there are certain miracles that are performed. And that is that Aaron takes his rod, or his cane or walking stick, throws it on the ground, and it turns into a serpent. And guess what? Pharaoh's people do the same thing with theirs. But Aaron's serpent gobbles up these other serpents. Later on in the same book, in the book of Exodus, we get the plagues. Again, you all remember the plagues. The plague of the frogs, for example. How does that come about? Because Aaron stretches out his rod and the frogs come in. He also brought them back in. We find Aaron performing great miracles, you might say. Aaron comes out on top of Moses in terms of the miracles. Now, you got to read this carefully to see that, but that's the way it actually shows up in that book of Exodus. Later on in that book of Exodus, we find out that Aaron was responsible, while Moses was up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, that Aaron was responsible for collecting all the gold the people had and making a golden calf and having them worship the golden calf. Now, what are you going to believe? He was a miracle maker, or was he the guy that created the idol, the golden calf? Which you get? Can anybody make a suggestion of what might be a solution? One of these stories comes from what? Comes from the Yawis. One of the stories that the story that involve. One of these stories involves the story of Aaron performing miracles. And we find out that story shows up only in the priestly source. You don't see it anywhere else other than the priestly source. The story of the golden calf shows up only one place, in the Yawis source. Two different sources, and we find one source portraying Aaron in one manner, and another source we see Aaron performing in just the opposite manner. Does this raise a question? Do you remember a few weeks ago I told you a good part of what we have to contend with in the Old Testament and partly in the New Testament is there seems to be a division among the Israelites, and that there were some that were following Aaron as being their leader and others that were following Moses as their leader. There were the pro-Aaron people and there were the pro-Moses people. How did that come about? Actually, it is later on in the book of Exodus and Numbers that we look at the history, we find out how this actually came about, that such a division would be created, and there would not be the surprise that there would be these two different sources, because there would be one group of people like the Yawis and the Elohis who would write the stories one way, and the priestly writers would write it another way. This we're going to have to develop in a lot more detail, because it is a part of Israelite history that is not insignificant. The reason being that this division lasts all the way into the New Testament. If you recall the stories that we have in the New Testament, how often we hear about the problems that might exist between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees did not seem to agree with certain things. As a matter of fact, one of the last things that we have even listed in the stories of Paul is that when Paul was still in Jerusalem, he managed to escape some real problems when appearing before the Sanhedrin, which was composed of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Does anybody remember how he did that? He got the Pharisees and the Sadducees to argue with each other about the resurrection. And while they were arguing with each other about the resurrection because they didn't agree, Paul left. That's one of the last things we read about in the New Testament about Paul. Still a separation that, a separation that dates all the way back to the time of King David. But it takes a long time to develop this, and that's why we're going to go through that rather carefully. And that's why that to be announced is there. I will talk about Exodus and Leviticus in some detail. I looked up a little bit of Leviticus recently, and I decided we won't talk too much about Leviticus. There's a long, long chapter about how you handle your neighbor's bull if he comes into your yard and things. It's all about the law and the way that people would follow the law. On the other hand, this is not a reason for us to neglect the other part of the Torah, namely the book of Deuteronomy. Now, go back to this picture that I had before. Oh, I guess I don't have that. Remember, we talked about this before. The Torah has all of the four different parts. J, E, P, and D are all a part of the Torah. Deuteronomy stands by itself. It stands by itself. It does have two editions. This is why there's a Deuteronomy 1 and Deuteronomy 2. The reason for the two editions is that the first edition, there's something a little bit lacking. I'll tell you what it was. And that is that in the first part of Deuteronomy, we're told that the book of Deuteronomy is a sermon that Moses gave to the Israelites just before they crossed the Jordan River, just before they went into Canaan. And the sermon was simply this: if you follow my commandments, says the Lord, that land will be yours. You will have the promised land. If you do not follow the commandments, then you will lose the land. Then you will lose the blessing. In Deuteronomy 2, they took care of something else. They had Moses die. Because the way it read before that, Moses did not die. But Deuteronomy 2 includes a little bit about what happened after that sermon, and that Moses died. And that's why we get the total Deuteronomy here, which turns out in the Torah, but also leads through the Deuteronomic histories and leads to these books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Here again is that chart I showed you before. In order to understand the book of Deuteronomy, we actually have to get into some of the history. Let me tell you a little bit about Josiah. If we read this carefully, we find Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. Josiah was the great-grandson of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the good kings. Hezekiah lived around 700 BC. Hezekiah was followed by his son Manasseh, who was one of the most wicked kings. He reigned for 55 years when he finally died, and he was followed by his son Amon, who somebody fortunately killed off very early on, who was just as wicked as his father Manasseh, and they were left with a little boy, and that little boy was Josiah. We don't know who it was, but somebody picked up Josiah. Maybe some priests that were in the temple, who knows what they were. But they took care of this Josiah as a baby because he was really the crown prince. He would be the new king. And when he was 8 years old, they put him up on the throne. I'll get back to that. Here's a picture of him actually being crowned when he was a king, when he was made king. It reads here that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he walked in the way of David his father. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphat, the son of Azariah, the son of, there's one of those names again, the secretary, to the house of the Lord, saying, go up to Hilkiah, the high priest, that he may reckon the amount of money which has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. He said, there's money there, let's refurbish the temple. This was an evidence again of Josiah doing the right thing. I've got about 3 minutes. When they were refurbishing the temple, guess what? They came across a manuscript. When they were tearing down some wall or something, they came across a manuscript. And here we see some of these priests looking over this manuscript and saying, what is this all about? They took that manuscript, they read it very carefully, and then read it to Josiah. Well, what that manuscript was a part of the book of Deuteronomy. As a matter of fact, when you go to your Bible today, the oldest part of your Bible that you have in terms of the writing the way it was originally is parts of the book of Deuteronomy. Probably chapters 6 through 26 are pretty much the way these priests had found this in the temple, and pretty much the way it was read to Josiah. This resulted in something rather significant, and that is Josiah effected a reform, which is, guess what that reform was called? Josiah's reform. And what we find is a very, very active period in which Josiah saw to it that the people returned to worshiping God and following his commandments the way they should. Is there more to the story? Yeah, but I can't get into it today. But very quickly, let me tell you something here. Josiah was very successful in many regards. But there's something that is very significant that we have to develop rather carefully here, and that is that Josiah was living in Jerusalem. He was living in Judah. But were there other things that were going on in the world at that time? Yes. And up to the north, guess what was happening? The Assyrians were on the move. Under Tiglath-Pileser in 740 BC, Tiglath-Pileser starts moving out of Nineveh, which is in the upper part of Mesopotamia, moving east and conquering one place after another. As he did that, he went all the way down to the point where he actually had taken the 10 tribes, the northern tribes, and we find out in 722 BC, the Assyrians had demolished the 10 tribes of Israel, put an end to it. Some of them got deported off into other parts of the Assyrian Empire. Some of them escaped down to the south, but Israel was lost after the Assyrians had come there. I'll have to go with this a lot. Just give me one more minute here. The Assyrians tried to conquer Jerusalem at one time, and they were not successful. Do you remember that during the time of Hezekiah, the Assyrians were laying siege on Jerusalem, and the angel of death came and slew many of the Assyrians. Well, we don't know really what happened, but Sennacherib, who was the king of the Assyrians and the leader of that army, went back to Nineveh. He went back to Nineveh, where he, 10 years later, was killed in an assassination. And one of his sons, Esarhaddon was his name. Esarhaddon succeeded him, and Esarhaddon brought the Assyrian Empire to its very pinnacle. Now, when I say pinnacle, what does that always mean? From there on, things are going to go downhill. They didn't really go downhill. The next man in line was Ashurbanipal, and he spent money like nobody had ever seen before, to the extent that when he died, the Assyrian Empire did not have the control that it had before. I have a list somewhere of the 3 people that succeeded him, but I don't know where the list is, and I'm not going to find it, because for all practical purposes, the Assyrian Empire was falling apart. Guess what Josiah is doing back in Jerusalem? He says, if the Assyrian Empire is falling apart, maybe they don't have that much control over that territory that was held by the 10 tribes. And maybe we can get that back and make this a united kingdom again. And that became a very powerful moving force as far as Josiah was concerned, to renovate the idea that Israel should not just be the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, but have all 12 tribes and get that territory back. We're going to talk about this rather extensively next week. But what have I always told this class? You may read ahead. If you want to read it, it's all there, and it's written very clearly in the Bible as to just what had happened, and had tremendous effect on what happened as far as the Israelite history was concerned. The end.